Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Danube Institute and my colleagues here, may I welcome you to this, we don't describe it exactly as a conference, we describe it as a forum, which implies, of course, that we want input from the floor as well as from the platform, and we expect also in the platform, because we have some extremely distinguished speakers, but also some extremely heterodox speakers too, we expect to have a good deal of debate and argument backwards and forwards. This is because, before I say anything more about the conference, I should just say one thing, which is one of the speakers last night was rushed to hospital for an emergency operation and will not, therefore, be attending the conference. Unfortunately, he's got an emergency appendectomy, and it's, in fact, one of our young stars, Tamás Orbán, who is now in Brussels on the staff of the European Conservative, but who started here, effectively, I think, as an intern, but went on to do great work here. In fact, I'd say he's one of those people who, when you meet him, you realize after a short time he's going to be a major journalist in the future. He's a man of real talent in his writing as well as clear-sighted in his thought. So, on behalf of you, I send him his best wishes for a swift recovery. We think we have a replacement, but it turns out we don't have a replacement, which means I'm going to have to be the replacement for to the speech of President Klaus shortly. Now, I will just say a few brief words about the conference because most of what I would want to say is in the little brochure you have on your seat. I think we are all conscious, perhaps not conscious enough really, of the fact that we are meeting here within a relatively short distance from where a war is raging. And that war is going to have, like all wars, even wars which do not rise to the level of a major international war, this, I think, certainly does rise to the level of a European war, and there's no doubt that but like all wars, it's going to have impacts on the future. And that is because the peace has been maintained in Europe by both NATO, well, especially by NATO, and by the United States. NATO has meant that the United States is a European power and has been since 1945. The Americans left only briefly and were soon back. And the impact of NATO on Europe was that no major war could happen because the United States would not tolerate a major war between different European powers. Other kinds of wars have happened and may happen again. Namely, the kind of war in which insurgents try to overthrow a government. But nothing of the order of the kind of wars that distorted the continent's history before the Second World War and indeed in the 19th century. So we are indebted in a way to NATO and to the United States for that fact. NATO is in essence a union of the United States with Europe, Western Europe. One of the changes of the result of this war could well be that new alliances are going to emerge within Europe and weaken the alliance with the United States. Is that a certainty? No. But it's one of many possibilities. And I think one of the reasons why we have James Bennett as our first speaker is because he has been the author of a book called The Anglosphere Challenge, which has essentially argued that in the circumstances of the internet age, links between countries are going to be more determined by cultural factors than by geography. And Insofar as that is true, and it's a book which in many respects has proved very prophetic, it's 20 years since it was published. If that is true, we must expect tensions between America and maybe since Brexit, between the Anglosphere as well, because whether or not Brexit has meant that Britain ceases to be a European power and becomes significant mainly as a member of the English-speaking world, and not only Brexit, but the recent AUKUS agreement between Australia, the United States, and the UK to share the building of nuclear submarines that will be part of the American list of alliances designed to deter China and to control the rise of China. That is going to be, that has meant that, and this has been noticed in this part of the world, this is a sign that somehow or other the English-speaking relationships are proving to be quite powerful, sustaining themselves longer than many critics have expected, and maybe will continue to be an important factor in international relations. Now, if the impact of the Ukraine war is going to result in changes within Europe between the different countries and alliances, and if the Anglosphere alliance is showing greater longevity and importance than perhaps we might have expected, and if Britain is detaching itself, could one of the changes be that there is a drifting apart of the Anglosphere countries from Western Europe? And if so, what would happen as a result? That's one thing. But of course, it's not the only relationship that is likely to come under strain or likely to produce new alliances in the next few years as a result of the war, a war which at the moment is undetermined in its final result. And it might not have a final result, indeed might have the same kind of result as the Korean War, in which a ceasefire goes on endlessly. I wouldn't rule that out, and indeed the Hungarian government policy is to obtain a ceasefire as soon as possible, and then, in a sense, wait and see how, in conditions of a ceasefire, negotiations then proceed. Now, whether you agree or not with that, it's a policy which we'll have to, in a sense, examine and pay attention to. However, for the moment, let's raise our sights above the immediate impact and ask James Bennett, who is somebody who's shown an ability to, well, I imagine, let me put it this way, having had several conversations with Jim in the last few days, I think you must have a very high security clearance, Jim, because you know things that I never even guessed. But having given that teaser, I'm going to say, I look forward to what you have to say, and then Marek an old friend of the Institute, originally someone born and brought up in England, but of from Polish parents, who soon after 1989 returned to Poland, I think at that point as the representative of the Margaret Thatcher Institute. That's when we first met. And secondly, established himself there and is now a really significant a significant consultant to the defense industry, and someone therefore well able to navigate some of the problems we've just been discussing. So my first pleasure now is to introduce Jim Bennett. The floor is yours, Jim.
Was here about 12 years ago for Danube Institute, and the world has changed quite a bit since I've been, but the city is as lovely as ever. It's quite a historic day, or historic year. This is the 20th anniversary of the publication of the Anglosphere Challenge, and many of the things that I discussed are going in that general direction. Some of them aren't. and that's quite interesting. Also, 85 years ago, a son of Budapest, a person who was born here and educated here, did a remarkable thing which triggered off a long chain of consequences. This was Leo Szilard, the physicist, who was, thanks to the anti-Semitic policies of the area, gifted to the United States. And at the end of August 1939, he had received a word that a team of German scientists had split the atom, which had been considered impossible up to that point. He immediately talked to his friend Albert Einstein, and he drafted a letter to be sent to President Roosevelt under the signature of Einstein, explaining the significance of the German splitting of the atom, particularly in the military sphere, and recommending that the United States immediately begin work at the highest possible level, because he rightly saw that accomplishment made the use of nuclear weapons possible, and that what an enormous catastrophe for the world would happen if, led by the brilliant physicist Heisenberg, got it first. Roosevelt immediately agreed and began a highly secret project with a very high clearance. And this is a time when America had upped its defense spending by an enormous amount already in anticipation of the war. But they got first priority, and obviously that led to the Manhattan Project and the American atomic bomb, which then led to the Soviet atomic bomb, and thereafter and thereafter. What's interesting about this is that even the first atomic bomb was built in reaction to the fear that somebody else had one. And this set a pattern which has gone on ever since. Every bomb that was developed since then was developed because somebody in that government was afraid of somebody else who had them. So it's actually quite amazing that deterrence has gone on as long as possible. So although I'm going to talk about nature's of structures, organizations, international relations, it is all colored by the fact that I believe we are now entering a new era in terms of nuclear proliferation and attitudes towards it, triggered in large part by the fact that one of the parties of the Ukraine conflict is a nuclear power, and they have made, the leader or high government officials have made over 100 threats to use nuclear weapons in the course of the war. Whatever the outcome of the war is, that genie is now out of the bottle. It had been basically taboo to suggest or mention the use of nuclear weapons, even in very dire conflicts like the First Korean War, the Vietnam War, where in 1956, France asked the United States to give it several atomic bombs to be used at Dien Bien Phu. Eisenhower, being a person of sound military judgment, turned them down, but that kicked the French atomic bomb program into high gear, which led to the French getting the bomb, developing ballistic missile submarines and ballistic missiles, all by the mid-1960s, which then led them to feel confident enough to leave the military side of NATO. So these things have consequences. This is the first time this has happened, and I believe that we are now at the end of the post-Cold War era, of the era of effective anti-proliferation measures, and we are in a new era. You can call it the post-non-proliferation era. I also call it the era of the rise of the small empires, and that is not intended in a literal fashion. I don't expect to see crowns and feathered hats and the revival of the 19th century, but I do think that it creates the prospect of an intermediate form above the nation state, but below the large-scale international organizations that have been the aim and ideal of a lot of the globalist world. For those people, they think, well, the European Union is actually kind of small, but it's the harbinger of the future, and we can create a world in which these all interlink, and then it leads to a world government. I think that idea is effectively dead at this point. So what was the old world, as it says here? You had a tacit assumption that developed nations would not make full-scale conventional war on each other. You had a tacit understanding that nuclear weapons would only be used in response to nuclear strike. And 3, that nuclear guarantors would respond to nuclear strikes on protected states with nuclear responses, even at risk to themselves. In consequence, these were the real underpinnings of the international order and international law between 1945 and 2022. This has been superseded, but by what? That's the interesting question. I think we can all pretty much agree that if the Ukraine had retained its nuclear weapons in 1995 and not entered into the Budapest Guarantee System, full-scale invasion would not have happened, because I don't think there was much doubt that there would be a response to it. States will now belong to one of 3 classes. At the top are states with credible guarantee, are nuclear powers. Immediately next to them are states with credible guarantees of nuclear protection, and the rest of them are basically vulnerable to nuclear blackmail. The most likely response to the new environment will be a rapid race to proliferation. Here we go. What does this look like? The green states are the existing declared nuclear powers. Well, Israel is kind of quasi-declared. They're not officially declared, but everybody knows it. The blue are former nuclear powers or states that abandoned nuclear bomb programs. Some of these are quite surprising because not everybody remembers that Brazil and Argentina were in a nuclear weapons race back in the 70s and 80s, that Sweden had gone quite far towards having nuclear capability in the late 40s and eventually only abandoned it at the end of the 50s. They believed that things were calming down a bit, and it was getting quite expensive. The red are really interesting, the so-called latent or one turn of a screwdriver states, who basically could have an atomic weapon within a year without necessarily having to acquire any assistance from the outside. In other words, they have nuclear power plants, they have fissionable material reserves, they have the scientists, they have the industry to create the bomb parts, and they pretty much know what to do. I mean, it's no longer a secret, as they say, about government secrets versus corporate secrets. Nobody still knows how to make Coca-Cola, but everybody knows how to make a nuclear weapon. This is not reassuring. So Japan, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, Australia, Taiwan, South Korea, and Iran are generally judged to be within that near-term threshold. Obviously, places like the Netherlands have not given serious thought to it, but they have everything they need. And so it's a matter of a change of perception. On the other hand, someone like Iran only doesn't have it yet because a good deal of effort is being made by both Israel and Saudi Arabia, who work together far more than most people realize, to sabotage the Iranian program. But, someday that will work too. And the yellow ones are states that could develop or buy a bomb within 5 years. And Saudi Arabia, basically, they underwrote the Pakistani nuclear weapon program on the proviso that if Iran ever achieved nuclear capability, Pakistan would immediately send over a dozen or 2. And I think we're also quite close to that happening. So this is not a fanciful idea. This is reality. It's also the fact that even without considering nuclear weapons, states around the world are rearming rapidly in response to both the fact that it seems to be acceptable to invade countries without a lot of effective opposition, and also the war itself has revealed weaknesses in certain weapon systems and effectiveness in certain other weapon systems. And it's kind of ironic that Crimea and Sevastopol were major motivations, but one of the things that has now been seen is that the Black Sea is probably too small to keep surface ships in any kind of major conflict. The anti-ship missiles and anti-ship drones have been extremely effective, and there are no really obvious counters that will also have an effect on Chinese ambitions about Taiwan. However, people are going to be spending a lot of money on weapon systems. Conventional weapon systems are growing far more expensive because the fancy chips and the high performance you need for, say, a hypersonic missile, they're expensive, they're hard to obtain, there's a bottleneck on them. On the other hand, nuclear weapons are growing cheaper as we go on. The vast expansion of computer capability at low cost means that what took 3 years for the Manhattan Project engineers to work out with slide rules and desktop arithmetic calculators can be done by a good AI program in about 20 minutes. That reduces cost. Also, we know what we're doing. I'm not talking here about a gold standard deterrent system like the US, USSR, or France or Britain have with hydrogen weapons and ballistic missile submarines and ballistic missiles. Altogether, that is still a very expensive proposition. But silver standard or bronze standard nuclear weapons are now possible quite cheap. And by that I mean, if you look at a tank, a plane, or a ship that was built for war in 1945, state of the art of all of those, none of them would last 5 minutes on a modern battlefield. They're all obsolete. The Nagasaki bomb, on the other hand, is entirely potent and is still a Trump weapon. So, ironically, nuclear weapons are growing more attractive as a solution rather than less. And North Koreans have kindly shown by example that you don't have to be a rich nation to have nuclear weapons. As a matter of fact, it can be a quite poor, miserable weapon and miserable nation, and if you have the will, you can get your own nukes. Now, the other thing is, as poor nations start to develop their own nuclear weapons, they'll be anxious to defer some of that cost, and I think one of the most attractive ways of deferring the cost will be then selling their nuclear weapons on to other countries. I'm not entirely sure that if anybody on Earth came to Pyongyang with $1 billion and said, we want to buy a nuke, that they would get turned down. And if you threw in a couple signed Dennis Rodman jerseys, it would seal the deal. In a way, you say poor nations that can afford bombs can't afford not to sell them on. Therefore, we have something analogous to the Kessler effect in satellite technology, where if two objects collide in space, they create a lot of fragments. Each one of those fragments is at high velocity, and if even a small fragment that strikes a satellite can destroy it entirely, and then that will create a huge cloud of fragments. And this is a fast runaway thing. Well, with bombs, this is why people have always been concerned about proliferation. The easier and more powers there are, the easier to buy bombs, parts, designs, etc., the cheaper they will be. The market will work, unfortunately. OpenAI, I mentioned a bit about replicating all the Manhattan Project calculation with cheap open source AI programs. That's real. AI is only a couple years old, and OpenAI is only within the last couple of weeks, Elon Musk opened up his AI program and put the source code out on the internet, which means anybody can take it and do anything with it. We haven't even begun to think through the consequences of this, but we do know that only a couple years ago, only large states could have that kind of capability, and they had to pay billions and billions of dollars for it. Now it's free for download. That can't be without consequence. And then we also get a world where if the parts and the materials are widely available, there's a whole bunch of sub-threshold things you can do. It's not an atomic bomb, but it's still an extremely effective deterrent. Dirty bombs, which were conventional explosives but packed with radiological waste, can render a city or a large area of farmland unusable. It would kind of be like post-Chernobyl evacuation area. And they have long half-lives, so that's not good. Very low yield bombs. Even the Nagasaki bomb was actually highly inefficient, and they converted 7% of its fissionable material to energy, yet it was still a highly lethal weapon. Today it would be considered almost a fizzle, but that's no comfort to someone who's hit by it. INEDs, improvised nuclear explosive devices, that is a fancy word for blowing up your own power station. And if the Russians start to make a good deal of progress in southeastern Ukraine, I would not be surprised if the Kharkova nuclear plant were to go critical, and who can say who did it, but the prevailing wind is from the west to the east, so we know who would suffer the most. You could have a good chunk of south central Russia put into a Chernobyl-style evacuation zone, which would last, well, Chernobyl was, it's been an evacuation zone for over 40 years, and they're showing no signs of letting people back in. So that's all fun. So what do we get out of this in terms of what is it going to do to the world? Bombs as weapons need three things: bombs, delivery systems, and credible will to use them. Ambiguity used to be adequate. Some leaders are now willing to risk the consequences of action in the face of ambiguous consequences. I'm afraid Mr. Biden did not inspire fear in pretty much anybody in the world right now. Certainly nobody would have tried that with Harry Truman as president, because he had, again, the gold standard of credibility deterrence, because he already dropped 2 bombs. Nobody wanted to take the chance that he wouldn't drop a third one. Eisenhower, he did D-Day, he did a lot as president. He had pretty good credibility, but somewhere after Reagan, we started to get U.S. presidents who they didn't come up through the usual route of presidents up to that point, and often they were kind of flaky and definitely unpredictable. That is really dangerous to the whole concept of credibility of deterrence. Once lost, it can only be regained by actual use. That's the only thing that can't be faked. Similarly, nuclear guarantees as actors of alliances are weakening. If basically you can have somebody use a nuclear weapon, even if they have a guarantee, if you haven't struck the guarantor yet, you'll go back and say, if you hit us back because you extended a guarantee to country B, here, we're going to launch a massive attack on you. Yeah, probably not, but especially in democratic states, the leaders are very cautious about that. Can you really be true? And then we're back to the appeasement era before World War II. Marcel Déat and his who dies for Danzig? We may actually have that question come up literally again, except it would be Gdansk. So formal alliance structures aren't enough all by themselves, especially the more partners you have, the more different contingencies you're trying to guarantee against, they get less credible. What will work, I don't think we're going to go back to a state of every country against every country. I mean, that would be a whole separate argument, but that's, I think, where the realists like Mearsheimer and Walt fall down. In reality, that doesn't happen, especially with countries that have large ethnic populations from country B who are capable, they have a voice, they're capable of lobbying. So history, ethnic ties, religion, common purpose, these can lead to greater acceptance of risk. In the new era, smaller alliances formed around a credible nuclear partner may become a prominent state or quasi-state form. This does not mean the end of the nation state. I would say paradoxically, new, smaller alliances can only be formed from strong nation states with coherent national entities and a national narrative. Strong walls can only be made from strong bricks. And here I will observe that a major error of the EU has been their hostility to national feeling, because all this, the idea is the feeling goes upward toward Brussels and towards unity, Europe as an entity, but Europe is too diverse, and I think that the only place where you see genuine popular emotion about the EU is where people feel that it's a guarantor for their nation state. I.e., you go to the Baltic, you see a lot of people with EU flags, but they only love the EU because they think it's going to save their nation state. If you cause them to start to doubt that, that's going to go away. And you know, different nations in Europe and different nations in different places all over the world have real, not imaginary differences in values and preferences. Brussels has put together this kind of synthetic idea of what European values are. I mean, the whole idea of European values, unless you are kind of saying European values in contrast to Asian values, you can make some generalizations. But especially since the woke phenomenon has become part of Brussels dogma, I think that it's weakened the cohesion of the EU, and it's sabotaging the own desires of the Brussels establishment. Alliances and federations will probably arise out of the idea of common deterrent forces, strategic forces. It's easier because you only have a small number of units. You can leave most of the defense establishment of each nation alone, but you can have an alliance or a federation which will have the keys, will have some kind of effective elective parliamentary system, and hopefully not just formed out of people nominated by local parliaments, but actually have some local thing. So it looks more like a federation than an alliance. If it's with among nations that already have very strong ties and common feeling, then it might be quite effective. Paradigmatically, I'm also involved in some efforts on part of people who want to see a federation of the old Commonwealth states of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, is sometimes known as the Kanzuk Federation for the initials of the countries involved. That has the benefit of already having a gold standard nuclear deterrent, and there's actually some credibility of the idea that it could be transferred to a federal entity that would actually use it. As for the rest of the world, not all of them have the proper raw material for these, but many of them will have them or they'll find them. NATO was intended to be an alliance to extend the nuclear umbrella over Europe, to make national nuclear programs unnecessary. At first, the US didn't want the UK or France to have nuclear weapons either. They really couldn't do much about the UK because the UK was almost an equal partner in the Manhattan Project. France only had a few people there, but even in exile, de Gaulle began the initial French bomb program in 1944 as soon as he found out about it, and they were not going to be deterred from their own deterrent. But everyone else accepted that logic eventually. Poland, it's kind of amazing to know that Germany put serious thought into developing a nuclear bomb in the 1955-1960 time frame, and were only deterred by the US promising to put dual key nuclear systems in Germany so they would have a deterrent. It would be subject to US veto, but it would still be there. Now, and it's also the case that Poland and some other former Warsaw Pact nations were more or less blunt, although not publicly so, that NATO membership was the alternative to them developing their domestic bomb programs. And this was a logical thing. There's a general, in certain communities, there's this trope going around that the U.S. pushed its way into Eastern Europe. It's more like the U.S. was dragged in by threat of proliferation. And there's some serious errors floating around, or the idea that it could be easily reversed. It's certainly true that if a number of these states felt that the U.S. was going to be wishy-washy or wavering on holding up to its part of Article 4 or Article 5, then they would go ahead with the bomb programs. And I think, due to the chaos in U.S. domestic policy right now, we may have already passed that point. They may already be working on them. And as I said, some of these nations are pretty close, and it's mostly a matter of will on the part of the government. As I've already discussed, the EU is both too wide and, in consequence, too weak to serve as a credible partner for these nations. I don't think the French are going to hand over their nuclear deterrent system to pan-European control. That doesn't seem to be in the cards, and it's hard to imagine a pan-European nuclear program that would actually work. And if it did, it would take 30 years too long. If you go by what they've done with the space program, which I am quite familiar with, weak and divided responses suggest the EU will not realize its declared federal ambitions. There are too many people in the EU that don't want to see it go past a certain point. These entities are probably not going to go away. They serve useful coordination functions. They will work, in some circumstances, and I think the pan-European free trade is still of value, more value to everybody than otherwise. They have to come to reality about their stand on immigration and asylum, but that's a pan-Western problem, not just limited to the EU. So, as this saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Some old tunes might have echoes. And despite the fact that I'm saying a lot of the geographical factors underlying past national and imperial structures have gone away due to cyberspace, there is still quite a bit there. And the cultural affinities often do have geographical affinities. And so without saying that any one former empire is going to come back, some of them only had a function under certain circumstances, and when those circumstances change, they're not going to come back. But English-speaking people don't want Empire 2.0. Certainly in the historical third world colonies have no desire for that. But a limited-purpose federation, there is a movement in the Kazakh countries for that. There are members in the House of Lords who advocate it. So it's one of these things that it's only a very minority interest at the moment, but if it serves a purpose that most people realize needs to be served, then that can change very quickly. There's a number of possible configurations on the European continent. Certainly the central core of Europe, what are called the old Holy Roman Empire, going from northern Italy up to the Baltic, is still the economic engine of Europe and economic engine of much of the world. And they are probably more likely to consider tighter federation. They could do worse than adopting the ceremonial forms of the Holy Roman Empire. The European attempts to create emotionally striking symbolism for pan-Europeanism has been pretty weak. So, yeah. Same. Thank you. I keep forgetting. Scandinavia, of course, or Balto-Scandinavia, has a lot of close ties and near commonality. That would make a lot of sense. Pilsudski's intermarium idea, it's very interesting. It's been proposed in many different configurations and forms. They all have one thing in common: they never happened. So each of the nations in this region, Central and Eastern Europe, have strong national narratives, strong national identities. And I don't know, you may have some kind of pragmatic cooperation. You're headed there very nicely when Poland and Hungary and some other states were taking kind of a united front against Brussels on the cultural issues. I think, unfortunately, reactions to the war in Ukraine have kind of weakened that for the time being. But, even wars end and perceptions change. It's geographically very attractive and a more limited form of essentially reviving the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with Ukraine as another member, which has been proposed and never happened in various times, but it did have 200 years of good times in history. So who knows? If nothing else, if Poland and Lithuania formed a federation and then invited Ukraine in using the formula of East Germany's accession to the EU and NATO via unification with West Germany, would serve as a legal precedent, which might set up an interesting problem, but that's not about to happen next week. So all of these forms have been proposed and failed many times, but successful federations have also typically been proposed and failed many times before they happened. I'm fairly familiar with the English-speaking world, and tight federations were proposed in the United States. They were anathema to most people until in the post-Revolutionary War chaos, things like Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and encroachments by French and Spanish adventurers to try to tear the United States apart and annex parts of it, got people worried, and suddenly a strong federation became entirely possible and was put together in about 3 years' time. And the U.S. was so successful that all the Canadian provinces, which had been, they debated a unification of Canadian provinces into a single federation, for about 50 years, and they could never get everybody headed in the same direction. When the Civil War ended in the U.S., they suddenly realized that there was this enormous, very effective army right to the south of them that was now unemployed and maybe looking for something else to do. So all of a sudden, all the local objections to the Canadian Federation went away, and they put it together in 3 years' time space. Australia had a weak federal council in the 1880s and did nothing and was going nowhere, and everyone was quarreling. As soon as Germany started to get active in the area and annexed northern New Guinea and Samoa, suddenly they felt threatened, and again, the Australian Federation was put together in a couple of years. So things change, especially security-related things change everybody's perception. Where this is going to lead, I'm not sure, but I think this could be a viable middle ground between nation states and large organizations that aspire to eventually become a world government on, of course, the values of the people who are advocating it. So we'll not get into, we've already kind of discussed the intermarium area and some of the possibilities. So this is the new reality. The new reality is the post-proliferation, post-non-proliferation era. How we respond to that, it's up to us, but I think that there are some precedents in history and some principles of association. There's a school called realist thinking in international relations, but in my mind, they have, by not taking the changes in the nuclear environment seriously, they're being unrealistic. And it's time to broaden the discussion. And I hope that this talk will serve that purpose. Thank you.
Jim, before we invite Marek to respond, I'm just going to ask one question. Got a rich smorgasbord of possibilities. But you didn't mention one which which struck me as interesting. Obviously, the united response of NATO was a very important political fact at the following the invasion, and I think it remains a very important political fact because NATO has maintained a certain sort of unity throughout the period, even though there are obvious differences of interests and calculations. But there is one which fits into your analysis, and as I say, you didn't mention it, I don't think. And that is the fact that among the kind of intra-European alliances that have been born from the war, that between the British, the Scandinavians, and the Baltics, Ukraine and Poland, which has actually resulted in treaties and defense cooperation, it strikes me as one of the most interesting. And I wonder if you have any comment on it.
Yes, one of the I think mistakes the U.S. has made since 1945 is to put so much faith in the European Union that they tend to want to run their relations with many European states through Brussels. And I think that's, for all the reasons I discussed about why the EU is only going to get so far and ignoring the importance of national values, a dialogue between Washington and the Eastern and Central European capitals directly, not going through Brussels, is really important. I think it should probably be the predominant form of discourse. And if you were to have these groups or alliances to come together in some kind of formal form, that would make it even stronger. Kissinger famously said, if I pick up the telephone and want to talk to Europe, who do I talk to? Well, you will never find one person that will have that function. You might be able to find a smaller grouping of nations in Europe with very like minds, having an entity whose head could be a person to call. So again, we're talking about why there are middle grounds between individual nation states and pan-continental or global organizations that are probably more realistic than the former.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jim. And now let me turn to Marek. You actually have the job of foreseeing, planning, and attempting to persuade governments and companies to organize themselves to provide defense. So I hand over to you.
Would you like me to sit here or stand? Okay, I feel a little bit more relaxed, and I'm standing. I'm not that exposed to the barbs from the audience that may or may not come. Well, first of all, John and Melissa, thank you so much for this invitation. It's always a delight to be here in Budapest and to be part of your Danube initiative. And the platform that you provide for these sort of discussions, I think, is extremely valuable in Hungary today. So I really do congratulate you. And also on this particular event, which, thanks to this very inspiring initial talk by James, opens up I hope, over the course of today, a broader discussion about the where we are with the Anglosphere and to what extent what is commonly known as the Anglosphere actually still today, post the Russian invasion of Ukraine, remains the as it were the beacon that it was for a long time for many countries in Central Europe. So let me move on to my own comments, which I hope will overlay, as it were, your very interesting presentation and together give a more comprehensive view. Now, of course, I'm at a disadvantage in discussing the Anglosphere, not only because, despite my English accent, I am actually Polish, but also the real expert on the Anglosphere, of course, is our mutual dear friend Daniel Hannan, now Lord Hannan, who has done sterling work over the last couple of decades in promoting the concept of the Anglosphere and explaining why it is such an attractive force in geopolitics. So I'm not going to pretend to sort of emulate the erudition of Daniel, which he would undoubtedly display at this meeting. But I think what Daniel Hannan, I'm sure all of you are familiar with him, was trying to sort of say when he brought out the concept of the Anglosphere was to sort of to see what was the most solid, committed and vibrant relationship between countries around values. And certainly the Anglosphere is actually a very attractive concept at face value. I mean, on the surface, it talks about a strong cultural, moral, political, geopolitical relationship between countries coming from a common language of English, common legal systems, the traditions of the common law, independent judiciary, the concept of the separation of powers, and above all, a fundamental acceptance of the value of Western civilization writ large, and basically having a self-identity which recognizes the broad civilizational values of the West as being something valuable and generating an identity. And I would say one more thing about the Anglosphere. Paradoxically, a rejection of imperialism, which is a paradox because, of course, the Anglosphere was created, in large part through the British Empire. But the Anglosphere today is really about rejecting imperialism, following on from the grand British tradition of the dismantling of empire, but above all, stating the importance of sovereignty, of borders, of state independence, and a rejection of imperialism or aggression as a form of determining the course of history. And from the perspective of Central Europe after 1989, the Anglosphere thus defined was obviously hugely attractive. I mean, it was the basis of the dynamic for the rejection of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And within the Anglosphere, it was the United States and the United Kingdom which was seen as the most attractive elements of the Anglosphere. There was the lodestar, as it were, the beacons that brought Central Europe back into the family of democratic nations. That was obviously much driven by the almost mythological status of both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who were seen as essentially the champions of Western values, of Anglosphere values, if you like, during the Cold War, and their robust approach to maintaining the coherence of NATO against the Warsaw Pact, particularly in the European theatre, the robust deployment of Pershing and crews, the maintenance and development of a nuclear presence in Western Europe under the Cold War, particularly in Germany through nuclear sharing, and of course the UK with its own independent nuclear deterrent. But also Thatcher and Reagan having seen as a beacon not only for geopolitical reasons but for ideological domestic reasons, and being principled defenders of the capitalist order, the free market order, which is again another constituent element of what we would generally call the Anglosphere, the respect for free markets, for private property, for free trade, for sound currency. And obviously, economically, Lady Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were seen as champions of the capitalist order, not only the international moral order, but also the economic capitalist order. So it was no surprise that after 1989, the concept of the Anglosphere, and particularly the Anglo-American transatlantic relationship, was seen as very attractive to the countries of Central Europe. Post-1989, Europe understood institutionally, as well as in particular capital cities, seemed rudderless. There was tardiness amongst European policymakers on the issue of both NATO expansion and EU expansion. We took too long to get into NATO, took too long to get into the European Union. Germany and France, from the perspective of the Central European capitals, seem to be in thrall to a capitulationist attitude towards their historical challenges, particularly in relation to Russia. We know about the way in which the German political establishment after 1989, throughout the 90s and the noughties, was captured by Russian state interests through economic policy, through gas policy, through corruption. And obviously France itself was seen by many Central European capitals as ultimately a less attractive bilateral partner than the US because of its US skeptic policies, the constant return in French politics of ideas of European autonomy in relation to the United States or in terms of developing a European defense capability. So again, this was seen as something which was unattractive, and also in relation to China. I think there was also a period where the deepening reliance of the European economy on Asian supply chains, particularly looking to Asia as a source of long-term supply chain stability, was also something that was starting to cause concern in Central Europe. And Central Europe itself at this point, throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, also seeing its own independent identity as being something very attractive. This was the period of the ascendancy of the Visegrad concept, of the Visegrad Four. Later on, actually 10 years or so ago, you had the birth of the concept of the Three Seas Initiative, which is the latest iteration of the Intermarium. And so Central Europe, particularly Poland, in alliance with Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, very interested in building up a robust regional identity, focusing on areas of infrastructure collaboration, economic collaboration, also facing many similar challenges from Brussels, particularly on energy issues and so on. Looking very much trying to sort of develop a coherent independent identity, and again looking to a strong bilateral relationship with the United States and with the United Kingdom. And the apogee of this, of course, came with Brexit in the United Kingdom, where the UK government, particularly under Boris Johnson, and later for a very short period under Liz Truss, were found actually the UK trying to seek out a new role for itself outside of the European Union, on the one hand, but also trying to develop very strong bilateral relationships with Poland, with other Central European countries, on areas of defense collaboration, defense industry cooperation, energy cooperation, and so on, and trying to sort of continue to play the role of an anchor, as it were, a bridge between Central Europe and the United States. So, and of course, on the United States side, this was a time when the United States, particularly under Bush Sr., Bush Jr., and even the interregna, as it were, of the Clinton administrations and the Obama administrations, actually having a very robust transatlantic posture in defense policy, having a very ambitious global, strong ambitions in the global space. So again, the US very much in an internationalist mode. Of course, there were nuances and differences between Republican and Democrat administrations, but nonetheless, the US remaining a robust, not only a transatlantic player, but also a robust global player. So the United States are very attractive. Very attractive. The Anglosphere during this period, a very attractive option for a coherent Central Europe, where themes of transatlantic unity, a robust defense policy, and also a sort of a cultural affinity were very, very strong. Things are shifting from that picture, and the real shift has happened over the last 3 to 4 years, driven in large part by 3 dramatic challenges to the fundamental pillars of what generally we would call the values of the Anglosphere. First of all, the fundamental challenge was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which for many people in Central Europe and elsewhere was seen and is seen as an existential challenge to Western civilizational values, everything that the Anglosphere defined itself as: freedom, democracy, liberty, cultural identity, being challenged by a new posture of Russia as an imperialist, aggressive power. And so imperialism, the very thing that the Anglosphere actually rejected, being seen as a new way of conducting foreign policy, and the legitimization of the imperialist ideal as something which was seen by many people in Central Europe and elsewhere as a dramatic assault on what was a fundamental aspect of Anglospheric values, if you like. Secondly, the rise of China, increasing evidence of the aggressive intentions of China, not just in terms of its own internal populations, but obviously the increasingly clear way in which China is seeking to manipulate the way it has been inserted into Western supply chains, technology chains, on the one hand, and also the territorial ambitions of China in relation to Taiwan, giving rise to what some people have called a techno-autocracy. In other words, a fundamental challenge to democracy, a re-legitimization of autocracy as a principle of governance, buttressed by a very complex and sophisticated technological apparatus of implementing that autocracy, and using that autocracy also as a way in which to challenge the freedom and independence of nations, whether they be within the China or outside it, as with Taiwan. The third challenge, of course, and we're seeing this unfold before our very eyes, is the rise of radical Islam and rise of radical religious fundamentalism driven by Iran and emanating in various ways, whether it's through the threat of destabilization through migration of radical Islamists, or the rise of radical Islamist movements, and especially the rise of Hamas and the very real threat, the increasing threat to Israel, which we're seeing played out today in Gaza, but also the re-legitimization of anti-Semitism as an acceptable form of legitimizing autocratic rule. So imperialism through Russia, autocracy through China, and fundamentalism through Iran, including the re-legitimization of anti-Semitism as a form of governmental legitimization, all being fundamental challenges to what the Central Europe regarded as the Anglosphere. So what has these three pillars, these three existential challenges, how have they affected the Anglosphere? Well, it's still a play which is being acted out as we speak, but I point out three interesting developments which are perhaps resulting in what we would traditionally see as the Anglosphere being seen as evolving into something different. The first shift, and I think this is speaking now from a Polish perspective, is a turn, a pivot back to Europe. This is very clear, especially in Poland, after the elections, especially in October of last year, where the new Polish government is now actually seeking to look to the European Union as the institution through which it has to work, at least in part, to secure its national security concerns. We've seen Poland under the new foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, who again is an old, how can I put it, an old acquaintance of ours, leading actually the argument that one of the new pillars of Polish foreign policy has to be a reintegration of a very strong bilateral relationship with both France and Germany, as well as an improvement of the coherence of European decision-making, an acceptance of the inevitability of an extension of qualified majority voting in key areas, including a renewed focus on defense and security issues, not so much through military strength, but an understanding that the European defense industry has to rapidly integrate, develop, and also expand its production capacities, particularly in munitions and precision fires, in order to generate a new industrial capacity to pick up the vacuum that may come if the United States' ability to provide munitions and weapons for the war in Ukraine starts to falter. And the best evidence, the best picture of that has been the recent visits and meetings between Donald Tusk, President Macron, and Chancellor Scholz, most recently in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, where Poland is now back into a triangular relationship, as it were, a revived Weimar Triangle relationship with Berlin and Paris. I note that neither Prime Minister Tusk nor Foreign Minister Sikorski, in the 5 months since they came to office, have actually visited the United Kingdom. There's been no visit to the UK by either. Lord Cameron did come to Warsaw, but there's been no public demonstration of that relationship, of the Anglo-Polish relationship that you had so strongly under the previous Polish government. The second pillar, so certainly Europe as an institution becoming more attractive to Poland and other Central European countries. And what I've said in relation to Poland is extended, I think, to other Central European countries, whether it's in the Baltics, whether it's the Czech Republic, whether it's Romania, and also some of the Nordics. Great concern in Central Europe about the stability of the US pillar of the Anglo-American relationship, not just because of the current gridlock in Congress, which is extremely unfortunate in the way it's preventing an acceleration of military aid to Ukraine, but also the deeper fissures within the US establishment, within the political establishment, and the danger of the United States being split into, on the one hand, quite a leftist Democratic Party establishment, skeptical towards Israel, and we're seeing signs of that in Congress, as well as being slightly skeptical on Ukraine, and as well as an institutionalization of the MAGA revolution within the Republican Party, leading to an increasingly isolationist Republican Party. Again, pro-Israel, yes, China skeptic, yes, but Ukrainian skeptic as well. So that pillar of the Anglo-American alliance as well becoming more seen as increasingly uncertain from the Central European perspective. And the third element, which we're seeing increasingly, is in contrast to the Central European, as it were, regional loyalties, which were so strong and on a multilateral basis, starting to fragment and fissure. We've seen, especially after the election of the new Polish government, a fundamental rupture in the Polish-Hungarian bilateral relationship. That's also being paralleled with the election of Mr. Fico in Slovakia. There's the problem of Vučić in Serbia. And so the commonalities that we've seen starting to fragment, and certainly from the perspective of Warsaw, the Visegrad Four, and even the Three Seas Initiative, to a certain extent being seen as much more secondary than they were. And also, frankly, in relation to Hungary itself. We're talking about the Anglosphere as having been the lodestar of Central Europe for so many years. Many in Poland look to Hungary now and see Hungary perhaps being more attracted by the Asia sphere. Stronger relations with Russia, stronger relations with China, the building up of this Turkic alliance as well. So Hungary, seen from the perspective of Warsaw, is drifting away from this Anglospheric orientation. So given these factors, on the one hand, an increasing attractiveness of Europe, on the one hand, secondly, concern about the internal coherence of within the United States establishment, and thirdly, the increasing loss of unity within the Central Europe. Can we actually still speak of a Central Europe which is attracted to the Anglosphere? Does the Anglosphere, in that sense, which Central Europe aspired to join, actually still exist, or is it a realistic motor of international relations? I'm not usually one for coining my own phrases, but actually I came up with a good one when I was conducting my research for this, and I thought of saying that actually, from the perspective of Central Europe, there's less talk of an Anglosphere, but perhaps what somebody might call rather clumsily a Westosfere is something which is much more apt at describing the situation where we're in now, where fundamentally you're looking at a completely new constellation of relationships. For example, taking the example of the recent robustness of the Polish-German and the Polish-French relationship, people are saying, well, there's us, there are the Czechs, there are the Balts, there are the Romanians, and we are going to work much more closely, not just with the United States, but also we're going to work with France and Germany as well to accelerate and try to strengthen this resistance to these three existential challenges of autocracy, imperialism, and fundamentalism that I described earlier. Bringing into that alliance countries which traditionally were not seen as part of the Anglosphere. So you're talking about bringing in a new global partners into this relationship, which would include, of course, Israel above all, but also Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, buttressed, of course, by a very vigorous Australia, but nonetheless, this new relationship, new global relationship of not Anglospheric countries, but Westocentric countries. In other words, countries who have emerged into democracy like Taiwan, like South Korea, countries such as Israel, which are robustly democratic but not traditionally seen as part of the Anglosphere. But together, these countries from the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, as well as the United States, working together to meet these grand trilateral challenges that I described earlier. I will just conclude very, very quickly by just slightly qualifying and injecting one or two other perspectives. Certainly, international collaboration is on the agenda, but also you're seeing signs of a revival of sovereignist attitudes, and particularly in Poland, on defense and security. There is an increasing sense that ultimately national security has to be based on three pillars: the United States relationship within NATO, the increasing relationship with the European Union, and the development of defense industry in the European Union, but also the development, a much stronger development of indigenous defense capabilities, whether it's in terms of industrial production, shortened supply chains for defense equipment, increasing stress on domestic production of defense capabilities. And very recently as well, although Poland, I was intrigued to see that you think that Poland could get in a nuclear bomb within 1 year. Not many people would agree with that in Warsaw, but what they are talking about in Warsaw is bringing in nuclear sharing as a way of giving Poland that sort of participation, as it were, in a nuclear umbrella. So much more sovereignty as well on the agenda. But also, finally, let's not forget, even in the most robust Anglospheric, Westospheric countries, call them what you will, there remains a fundamental ideological rupture within each of those countries. The woke assault on civilization is what Mrs. Thatcher would call the enemy within. We have an enemy without, which are these three disruptive powers of Russia, China, and Iran, but we also have an ideological enemy within each country of the woke establishment, which I hope we'll be discussing more about later on, still being something that we have to be very careful to be aware of, and it remains as much an ideological adversary as do those external champions of the enemies of civilization, whether it be in the Anglosphere or the Westosphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm going to extend this session till to another 15 minutes. Yeah, we have to.
May I suggest this can remain for the we have time at the end?
Yes, I realize that, but the point is the next session is an hour and 3/4, which is yeah. No, that's not a problem. It's not a problem. Okay, thank you. That domestic dispute having been solved, we will now move on. I want to. We've just had two extremely interesting and somewhat disquieting pictures of different kinds of fissiparous influences and threats, in effect. So, I want to put the same questions to all of you. I want to ask three questions. The first is, you have already... I'm going to ask this question first to Jim, because it was your last point. Namely, the rise of wokery or wokishness in particularly the United States, particularly England, and I think in Central and Western Europe to a much lesser extent. I don't just mention this because it's the topic of my next book, published next month. But it is interesting to me. So let me ask Jim, therefore, if you would deal with the question of the impact of wokishness on all of the questions that you have been discussing.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I mentioned it a couple times. We get back to the point of strong walls can only be made from strong bricks, and wokeness is a disease or malign phenomenon that destroys the solidity of the bricks. Nation states have been under assault from globalism from without and above, the idea of giving less authority to sovereign nations. But within each nation, there are active woke forces that are particularly bad for destroying the national narratives, trying to discredit the national narrative, sometimes in just ridiculous fashion. But once you adopt the basic analysis, the critical race analysis, etc., underlying these things, the so-called anti-imperialism and decolonization, there's no limit to how ridiculous you can get. And first of all, these narratives are factually quite wrong. Secondly, in order to have people cohere outside of themselves, their families, whatever, or these days the woke is also an assault on families, you have to share common perceptions, common values, and a common agreement. Especially with countries with large multi-ethnic populations, and especially with immigrant populations. The immigration only works at all when the people are expected to adopt the whole national story as they come in. This was easier at the end of the 19th century because actually most of the immigrant populations of America came from areas that were not nation states or only had been very recently become nation states and did not have strong national narratives. They had strong ethnic narratives, but not national narratives. So you didn't have to, trample on your old country's flag because you didn't care about your old country. It's kind of funny. There are people whose immigration certificates or their ancestors' immigration certificates would read Russian or Austrian, and actually they were ethnic groups who hated the Russian or Austro-Hungarian empires and did not at all identify as such people. That's one interesting thing. There's quite a few people from Ukrainian backgrounds in the United States, but almost all of them were admitted under other names, so they don't show up in the census. Canada had more of a post-World War I immigration from Ukraine, so they were identified as Ukrainians. It's the only reason Canada ever gave any military assistance to Ukraine in the interim between Crimea and the 22 was because Ukrainians actually make up an important voting bloc of several key provinces in Canada. Otherwise, I mean, they have almost no military. They sent like half of it to be advisors. So wokeness is a disease, or rather hysteria. I think clinically it probably comes under obsessive compulsive disorder, where people see, almost anything is like unclean or tainted. And in this case, it's any manifestation of their national narrative is, unclean. And if you look back over Anglosphere history, we have many periods of hysteria where suddenly some strange idea or perception becomes popular and you have a wide movement and they want to do ridiculous things and they do it for a while and then eventually it burns out. I think we're about 2/3 of the way through the cycle with woke, but we're not out of the woods yet.
There are 3 elections happening this year which are significant in relation to our discussion, I think. One, of course, is the American election. Another is the British election. I think that's pretty well known. The result is already known, I think, about that. The Tories are going to suffer a serious defeat and we'll have a Labour government. But the other one is, of course, the European elections. And I wonder if you, Marek, share what was, until your speech, really, the predominant view that there was going to be a shift to the sovereigntist right and the populist right, and that it would have an impact on policy. Some of your remarks just now suggest that that kind of sentiment is going into reverse. So what would be the effect?
Well, it's so difficult to predict certainly the European elections. Well, I think we can more or less predict the US election. We can definitely predict the UK election. I was actually going to make a comment about the impact that the Labour government under Keir Starmer would have on the Anglo-American relationship were there to be a Trump administration in the United States. So that's again another potential rupture. I'm no psophologist, and it's very difficult 3 months ahead to say what's going to happen. I think my own observation, and certainly the election result in Poland, is a sort of perhaps presages this. I suspect also we'll see this a little bit in the Slovak presidential election on Sunday, is that we slightly overestimate the ability of the right to mobilize at an election. And certainly we've seen in some of these European elections recently a very strong mobilization of youth voters, women voters coming out much strongly than usual statistically and not really being captured by the pollsters, and that was actually behind the Polish election result. And obviously there is no guarantee how that will reflect in the very complex electoral makeup of the future European Parliament. I will say that it's an interesting accident that actually on the 1st of January, potentially just before a President Trump is sworn in on the steps of the Capitol on the 3rd week of January of 2025, on the 1st of January 2025, Poland will take over the presidency of the European Union. And it's a Poland which is led by Donald Tusk, who's got huge experience as the former president of the European Council. I always forget which one was it. The European Council, and who has made no secret in the past of his skepticism of Donald Trump. We remember the tweets of the Polish Prime Minister in the last month or so, very heavily openly attacking the Republican majority in Congress on their dilly-dallying over Ukraine assistance. And there is also talk of the creation of a European commissioner for defense and defense industry and defense security. And there is a strong rumor, that perhaps Radek Sikorski himself might be a candidate for that post of commissioner. It's certainly something that von der Leyen has talked about creating. So you will have a European Union but the presidency, certainly for the 6 months, led by a country which has actually really pinned its colours to the mast that its future lies much more in collaboration with European Union partners rather than a stronger or bilateral relationship with a Trumpian United States. So it will be a very, very interesting 2025, which is why I think it's another another element which will be an additional centrifugal force between the European Union and the United States after next year.
I would actually describe Radek Sikorski as an old friend still, and well, despite political differences. But and I take what you've just said, but I wonder: is it correct to say that Poland as a nation has pinned its colours to this mast? It's the Polish government has done so. Has it rallied the country around that?
Well, we're sort of slightly getting into the weeds of Polish politics and electoral voting and so on. It was unfortunate during this election. Let me rephrase that. I think the result. There's a lot of hurrah optimism within the victorious camp of what is now the Left Liberal Alliance that is in charge of Poland. I think it's rather premature because Poland has yet to face the challenges that have actually driven conservative and right-wing forces in other European countries. It has yet to face the challenges of migration, and we'll see how that plays out because the Polish government is under increasing pressure to start working much more closely with Brussels on reallocation of refugees. The impact of the green energy policies which have been driving agricultural protests in Western Europe are now starting in Poland. But they're still at an earlier stage than you've had in Western Europe. Poland only from now is starting to move into, in terms of its financial relationship with the European Union, the next financial cycle will slowly but surely become a net contributor to the European Union as opposed to a net beneficiary in terms of the flow of funds. And after the first flush of European funding which has been released following the election to the government of Donald Tusk, that again I think will come, that fact will come to the fore. And on the topic that we've been touching on, Poland is only now beginning to face the brunt of the woke revolution. The impact of woke is only starting in Poland, but as it will naturally accumulate, that still will have, I think, a very strong political effect. So a combination of a meeting of Poland with woke ideology, the problems of migration, and the challenges of green transition, I think in very short order could lead to a revival of a much more robust conservative political situation, slightly contingent, it has to be said, on the condition, the internal political condition of the Law and Justice Party, which remains dysfunctional at its leadership level and requires a rejuvenation, frankly, of leadership, which is now, I think, in gridlock, certainly until the presidential elections of the middle of next year. And without this rejuvenation or redefinition of the Law and Justice Party, a revival of the Polish conservative right, I think, is going to be difficult.
I should just add to that it does look, maybe I'll be corrected in the later session by Frank, that the Labour government is going to be elected at precisely the high watermark of wokishness in Britain because at the moment there is a series of museums running anti-British imperial exhibitions, and it's hard to find a museum that isn't in the hands at the moment of woke ideologues in the guise of curators and critics. But of course, if we're correct in our predictions, we have a Labour government which will prosecute wokeness at the very time when it seems to have reached its peak. And we have an opposition which is going to find itself looking for strong issues to take up, and which has notably failed to really even worked out what it felt effectively about wokishness. We are likely to have wokery and a defense against wokery as one of the principal themes that will be used against Labour. So that's one thing. My final question is really to Jim, though, of course, you may want to just add in, and that's Ukraine. Ukraine and the right in the United States. Well, it's for you to say what your views are, but obviously the Republican Party is undergoing some kind of trauma over Ukraine. How do you think the party and America are going to come out of that?
Yeah, that is definitely a major factor at this moment. I think that the anti-aid to Ukraine sentiment is not widespread through the Republican Party. I think that it's part of a relatively small but very vociferous and well-organized group within the Republican Party, which is also very tied to conspiracy theories, anti-globalism, a whole mishmash of rather nutty positions, anti-vaccine, vaccine paranoia, this sort of stuff. And they are organized via the internet. They turn out to vote in primary elections. Most of the Republicans, I believe, are still basically from the old Reaganite consensus. And whatever is left of liberal republicanism, I'm not sure who represents them these days, but it's like in the eastern suburbs and part of California, there's still a force. Chris Christie tried to mobilize it for the presidential campaign. Nikki Haley failed to reach out to some of the communities that might have been strong supporters for her. That was a failure, and no other. Basically, you had Pence, you had Christie, you had Haley, who were defining themselves in opposition to Trumpism and MAGA, and they all had various flaws as candidates. So Trump ended up as the prospective nominee by default, not because he was actually the choice of the majority of the members of the party. It's maybe the choice of the people who went out and voted in primaries because they were highly motivated, but that doesn't run a country. So I think that Ukraine got picked up as a symbolic thing. Most of the people have no knowledge or care about Ukraine per se or Eastern Europe per se. What's a bit missing, a bit surprising, is that the ethnic communities in the United States, who are quite strong and have a lot of Eastern and Central European people, especially Poles, that's very self-conscious, self-aware, and organized, have not been brought into this in a strong way. I think if that happens, if that was effectively mobilized, it would affect the election. But Biden is not picking up on it. Biden thinks that just standing up and saying, "I'm not Trump," is enough to get him elected, because it worked in 2020. I think that we're seeing a moment in American history where and there have been moments like this in the past, where a particular sentiment or cause or something has electoral power, and because of the way the primary and first past the post system works, these people can, for a while, be effective. And the isolationism has always been an undercurrent, especially in the Republican Party, but I don't know. I mean, a lot depends on whether Trump wins or loses, because he's almost certainly too old to run again in 28. But then we see who's the successor. Typically, when these movements lose their steam, when they burn themselves out, there's a hardcore remaining, and they can remain for a long time. But most of the people fade away and go over to other movements, or just become more moderate people in their older age. So it's for play. I would certainly not assume that the Republican Party is going to remain isolationist over the long term.
Anything final to say? Good. In that case, I want to thank you both very warmly. We've had two remarkable presentations. We've had a very good discussion, and I look forward to. I'll now have a 5-minute break, and we'll start again. No break. No break. So, if President, thank you very much indeed, both of you. Welcome to the second session. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker, who is a distinguished elder statesman of Central Europe. Of course, President Klaus's reputation is probably best known for his work as the finance minister, the prime minister, later the president of first Czechoslovakia and later the Czech Republic. And that is a very distinguished record. He established a new country, helped to establish a new country. He established it on firm economic foundations, and it's generally accepted that the performance of the Czech economy under his leadership was one of the most successful transitions and subsequently simply a successful economy in Central Europe. Having said that, he has a second reputation which is less well known, but particularly today on this topic deserves a greater recognition. And that is, he organized and steered the velvet divorce between the Czechs and the Slovaks peacefully and successfully into history. Furthermore, at the end of that period, when the two countries had been working for some time, it was clear that both the Czechs and the Slovaks were doing better, separately, so to speak, than they had been doing individually. Why was that? Well, it was because the arrangements of the former country imposed on the Czechs, or they thought it did, an obligation to continually assist the Slovaks. And the Slovaks, it turned out, when that support had been removed, or its prospect had been removed, were capable of performing well in their new sovereignty. So his experience in that is very relevant to the topic we are generally discussing this morning. So it's with great pleasure, therefore, that I ask President Klaus to address us.
Isn't it better? Isn't it better to speak with the... Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. Many thanks for giving me a chance to participate in this very, very unique gathering. By the way, unique as always when it is organized by the Danube Institute, by John and Melissa. Once again, thank you very much. When I received the invitation at a conference with the title The Anglosphere and Europe, I was not sure I was the right person to be asked to say anything relevant to such a topic. I must say that I always take the titles of the conferences seriously. I don't like when the speaker comes and gives the same speech in Rio de Janeiro, Beijing, Melbourne, and Budapest, regardless the topic of the conference. And now I am absolutely confused. I came this morning here and understood that I am supposed to speak on the topic roads to serfdom, roads to liberty. Another confusion, you know. And then I must say that I prepared my notes before getting Melissa's Tuesday's email suggesting a new title of the conference: After Ukraine, Will the Anglosphere and Europe Stay Together? This is a confusion number 3. So I am really at a loss. So one possibility is to throw away my notes, which I prepared, and to say some simple, innocent answers to the questions. So let me use to stay with my prepared notes. I really took seriously the topic Anglosphere and Europe. So maybe my presentation will be a little bit more general than you would like. So the Anglosphere and Europe. I have many times visited, but never lived on the territory of the Anglosphere. Never in my life, with one short exception. In the spring of 1969, when many of you were not yet born, Melissa, I'm sure. So I spent a semester at Cornell University, upstate New York. At that time, Students for a Democratic Society tried to start a Marxist revolution there. And I remember feeling that as someone coming from a communist country, half a year after the Soviet invasion into Czechoslovakia in 1968, I remember feeling that I was to the right of everyone I met there at Cornell at that time. It's simple. Communism pushes you to the right, by definition. So those who didn't enjoy communism are always more or less on the left, looking at it from my position. The second reason why I hesitated to accept the invitation was that I really, to be fair, I don't feel like a true European. A true European, at least in the current European sense, defined by someone like Madame von der Leyen. I, of course, live in Europe and have lived in Europe all my life, but I feel a much stronger identity as a Czech, as a Central European, and as a Slav. Those are three identities which I feel very strongly. Europe is already somewhere, and I have just recently read a sophisticated article prepared by a serious psychologist who argued that a man can't have more than 2 identities at the same time. So I don't know whether it's true. So this combination, Czech, Central European, and Slav, gives me a special perspective which has been enriched. I have it in quotation marks, but those quotation marks are not necessary. Enriched by my 4 decades of life in the communist Czechoslovakia. As an economist who believes in methodological individualism, I don't like continental thinking. After discussing the topic of this conference with my friends and colleagues in Prague, I accepted that the debate doesn't have to be about geography or continents, but about the way how people who live there think, the way of thinking of people who live there, which means about their worldviews, about ideology. So let me, redefining another redefinition of the topic, let me redefining the title slightly. My suggestion is not to discuss it under the heading Anglosphere and Europe, but under the heading Anglospherism and Europeism. The first term is probably new or relatively new. The second one has been used by many of us for a long time. The artificial, not authentically evolving European unification process has been connected with the birth of an ideology which has been sometimes, and by some of us, called Europeanism. In 2006, 18 years ago, I published a small book on this topic with the title, What is Europeanism? It is worth stressing here today that I mentioned in it several names that inspired me the most, and one of them was, not surprisingly, John O'Sullivan, and his article, he forgot it definitely, his article, The EU's Usual Crisis, published in Quadrant in December 2005. I characterized Europeanism as a conglomerate of ideas, as a highly heterogeneous structure. I pointed out that this doctrine is insufficiently specified and unsystematically formulated, that there is almost no one who advocates it explicitly, and that Europeanism brings it together people with very different worldviews. I use the term meta-ideology and stress that Europeanism is essentially an illiberal view in the original European sense. I also spoke about the arrogant authoritativeness of this doctrine and argued that it expresses a powerful supranational tendency standing against the intergovernmental principle. I considered it a new, extremely naive and romantic utopism, which leads to a revolutionary turn of the normal course of events. Those are quotations from the 18 years old book. My unfriendly formulations suggest, at least I hope, that I am not an exponent of Europeanism. It should be taken into consideration that I published this book as a president of an EU member country who had signed the EU membership treaty only 2 years before that. This looks surprising now. There was still some freedom in Europe those days. I can imagine doing it now by a president of an EU member country. To my great regret, I don't have a book about Anglospherism. This term has been undoubtedly used by someone, but I am not aware of it. The Anglosphere has not been explicitly politically unified, and I am not aware of any attempts to do it. Nevertheless, this term exists and has so many vocal advocates and supporters that we may talk about an ideology behind it. However, this doctrine does not have its explicit Bible yet. I am afraid that the exponents of Anglospherism who are here with us today will start protesting against being labeled as such. Nevertheless, I dare argue that something like that exists, something special, something different in the behavior, in the thinking, and in the rhetoric of people I would call Anglosphereists. I will return to my communist experience. It remains to be my main comparative advantage in today's discussions still. It gives me a useful historic perspective. At that time, we used to differentiate the West and the East, not the Anglosphere and Europe. Nevertheless, in spite of that, our heroes in Central Europe and especially in my country, our heroes had always been Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, not Mitterrand and Kohl. The University of Chicago, not the Frankfurter Schule. Explicit opposition to Soviet imperialism, not the Helsinki peace process. I remember how we, in the post-August 1968 Czechoslovakia, hated the idea of the Helsinki initiative. Hated. I would like to say it very explicitly. The West Europeans were not able or ready to understand us. Nevertheless, I don't recall ever using the term Anglosphere then. So this was for me the stage number one, historically. Stage number two, it changed in the early post-communist years. Confronted with the, in our eyes, in many respects, socialist Europe, and with the collectivistic, centralistic, and non-democratic model of European integration, we came to the conclusion that the Anglosphere is different and much more inspiring as a model for us. Not surprisingly, our transformation process was better understood by Prime Minister Thatcher than by any other of the world political leaders. At home, I found it very rapidly a conservative or classical liberal party. Regretfully, the term conservative was stolen at that moment in my country, based on the Anglo-Saxon political and economic way of thinking, and won the first free parliamentary elections with it. The French and German politicians expected that we would copy their political and economic structures. But I explicitly criticize both the soziale Marktwirtschaft as something not interesting for us, as well as the European proportional election system and the demonization of political parties on the right. Our only friend among political parties was the British Conservative Party at the time, no other one. That was, however, not the end of the story. The third stage, when I tried to structure it, came at the beginning of this century. To our great regret, America, meaning the US and Canada and Great Britain, started to change more than Europe, which has more or less stayed the same or changed less radically. The aggressiveness of new ideologies of environmentalism, human rightism, multiculturalism, genderism, and wokeism, etc., hit the United States and Great Britain more than us in Europe. The reason potentially is that we are older, historically less dynamic, lazier, less flexible, less enthusiastic. We are also less naive. Our personal experience with destructive, non-democratic ideologies helps us in this respect. There is an interesting case of Great Britain. Brexit didn't help this country. London itself, as we see it now, is able to regulate its society and economy even more than Brussels, and to be extremely progressivistic even without the directives coming from the European Commission. As a result, the dangerous virus of progressivism is spreading more rapidly and more deeply in the Anglosphere. Putin has shifted us to stage number 4, which is closer to the title of the conference after Ukraine. He, with his Ukraine war, united the West, which was certainly not his aim. The war has become, however, a strategic disaster for Europe. The military, political and economic weakness of Europe has become more visible. The European elites don't want to see it and are using the war as another instrument for transforming the European Union into a superstate, into the United States of Europe instead. We, the citizens of smaller EU countries, are the victims of this. So people like me hate Putin more than just for attacking Ukraine. That was probably not his original ambition. The Anglosphere, because of the European weakness, once again dominates the West. To be frank, and it's not easy to say it here in front of so many Anglospherists, I must say that I am not happy with this turn of history. It would be impossible to say anything like that a quarter of a century ago. We always, people like me, we always understood Anglospherism as a positive way of thinking, which used to look optimistically forward. But we feel, at a distance, we feel a loss of this historic optimism in the United States today. Anglospherism used to be a much-needed advocacy of individualism, but with a recent switch to group and collectivist thinking, it slowly disappears to be. It used to be the stress on self-responsibility and self-reliance, but this has been impaired by a century of the welfare state. And it used to be the symbol of dynamism and workaholism, but we are witnessing a loss of the work ethics there as well, you know. I was shocked this morning, John, because I know that in the past all conferences organized by the Americans started 1 minute exactly at 9 o'clock, and this morning it started at 19:35. You know, this is an example of the loss of original Anglospherism. So I think I could, and you definitely could much better than me, continue tentatively listing the positives of the normative Anglospherism. But there should also be a serious attempt to prepare the descriptive side of it, to put down the positive Anglospherism that is, in my opinion, missing. Distinguishing the normative and positive means that I'm an old-fashioned person who still believes in the methodology of science advocated by Milton Friedman. I hope there are some here who remember his famous book, 1953, Essays in Positive Economics. This is something what we studied in the dark communist days, not after communism. I'm coming to the end, you know. I hope Europe is becoming aware of its passivity and irrelevance, especially its superpowers. France and Germany are now talking about it. Macron's recent speeches about the strategic autonomy of the EU suggest that something is in the air. But to be frank, I don't believe it. It is more rhetoric than substance. It may be a new version of the 1968 Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber's Le Défi Américain. Maybe someone remembers the book, which I wrote a book review about it in 1969 in Czechoslovakia. Le Défi Américain. Or it may just be a short-sighted pre-election initiative before the European elections to come with an idea. I don't know. And definitely I don't believe it is serious. So returning to the new title, Melissa, of the conference, I would conclude that Anglosphere and Europe, I suppose, will stay together, but Europe will not be in a position of being a real partner. Thank you for your attention.
President Klaus, thank you very much indeed. Now, I've been given by the force of accident the responsibility of responding to your remarks, which is quite difficult for me because I don't really disagree with them in any important way. And that, after all, disagreement is the basis. It's the grit in the oyster. It's the grit in the oyster that produces the pearl. And unfortunately, I don't have any pearls to distribute as a result. But I will first of all just briefly defend our changing titles here. You may have seen the film The Manchurian You may have seen the film The Manchurian Candidate, in which a McCarthyite senator is explaining to his wife, who is, of course, the dominant partner in this, played by Angela Lansbury, and he says to her, darling, can't we just agree on how many communists there are in the State Department? You keep giving me a different number. And as he's saying this and asking for help, he's pouring some ketchup over his French fries. And she says, all right, darling, we'll try to find an easy-to-remember number. And then you cut to him saying, there are exactly 57 communists in the State Department. But she has explained to him, are these people asking, are there any communists in the State Department? No, they are asking how many communists are there in the State Department. So that's a way of getting you to sort of deal with a whole range of problems. But thank you very much. Now, I think back in the 1950...
No. I just want to make a comment. For a very long time after the fall of communism, I was always at gatherings like this one, refusing to accept the easy using of term communism and communists, because I had a feeling that it's wrong to trivialize the issue by calling everyone a communist, that it's wrong to compare Comecon, if there is someone who remembers what the terms mean, Comecon with the European Union. I called it always trivialization and so on. Now, John, I'm sorry to say that I am not protesting against that. It's probably much more relevant these days.
Well, it is much more relevant these days. But of course, your point is a fair one. Somebody whom I know Frank will know, Alfred Sherman, is one of Mrs. Thatcher's advisors. He had been a young communist who had actually gone as a 14-year-old to fight for the government side in the Spanish Civil War. Well, he used to complain bitterly when people claimed to be communists and saying there should be an act called the Marxist Act, modelled on the Architect Act, making it a criminal offence to claim to be a Marxist unless you could pass an examination in it. And of course, there is something in that.
And after 68, when the Russians came, I was fired from the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences as a non-Marxist. You know, that's a good sign.
Well, yeah, that's certainly something you would probably want to have printed, so you could produce it to prove this. But I think that we should really look to the origins of the Anglosphere and Europe situation to the Second World War. Obviously, the Brits were the main basis of resistance to Nazism militarily at the time, and after the war, when the Americans first started to go home, in his speech at Fulton, Indiana, I think, Winston Churchill proposed three things. One, a united Europe that in this case did not include Britain. Secondly, an alliance, a worldwide alliance between America and Britain in military, intelligence, political, and almost all other terms. He said he would have proposed something like something even closer, as he had done in 1940 with France. But in fact, that was the closest he could go to merging the two countries. And of course, that policy was followed, both with the formation of NATO on the one hand, and secondly, later the organization of the EU. And the things which were distinctive about this were, first of all, Britain was allied to Europe and America under NATO. But it also was allied to the United States on a whole range of external to NATO issues, in a way that the rest of Europe was not. I mean, there were a series of, and obviously Suez disrupted, but only briefly, this relationship. So in Europe, in the Korean War, in the Korean War and in other ventures of the United States, except for Vietnam, the Americans and the Australians were always the partners of the United States. It was quite remarkable. And many people in Britain thought it was damaging to British interests, and still do, and think it was a mistake. So this relationship, however, carried on. Now, the relationship between this military alliance and economic policy was quite interesting. The Americans, in their relationship with Europe, and in kind of the subsidies, for example, that the CIA gave political parties and started magazines, the CIA supported the non-communist left. It did not support the Christian Democrats. It wasn't opposed to them, but it was opposed to free market policies, parties like the Italian liberals. It didn't like them because it felt that they were encouraging economic policies that would not work for the working class. The influence of America in economic policies in Europe was to support fundamentally large, flabby, neo-corporatist parties. The Christian Democrats never described themselves as conservative. From the early theoretical discussions in the war, they didn't. They called themselves center parties, and they still do. And that has had consequences today. The parties which were free market, and the Conservatives weren't a totally free market party. That had been the old liberals who basically collapsed and were reborn as social democrats. So economically, the alliance between the Americans and the Brits was, so to speak, closer in economic policy, although the Americans were encouraging much more centrist and neo-corporatist policy in Europe, and did so until the end of the war, the Cold War. Now, the Cold War, the first impact of the Cold War ending in European politics was to effectively destroy the Italian Christian Democrats. It worked because they had been kept in power by the desire of Europeans not to have a government that was that was uncertain about its alliance with the United States and its resistance to communism. And the left was, the left parties, the SDP in Germany, the Labour Party in Britain particularly, they were pretty sound for most of the wartime period. But their left wings, the left wing of the SDP and the left wing and the same was true in France, the left wing of the left parties was not. I mean, it was neutralist. And the neutralism flowered dramatically in the 1980s when you had governments that were pursuing a clearly activist policy to resist communism and the Soviet Union more strongly. This flowered in the peace movement. And the peace movement in 1983 and 4 was able to put, well, you will remember this, you were able to put 1 million people on the streets of major cities. And there is no doubt that the decision to plant the US missiles to counter the Russian missiles aimed at Western Europe, there's no doubt that that decision was key in ending the Cold War. Not just in ending the Cold War, but ending it on Western terms. Those missiles were bitterly resisted by the left, the peace movement, and the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union gave its support, but it had domestic roots in all these countries. So, the Reagan-Thatcher and Kohl alliance was very, very important in winning the Cold War. Once those missiles were successfully planted, the Soviet Union knew the game was up. That was the end of the conflict. They then, in the peace conferences which were held at Geneva, Reagan and Gorbachev, and subsequently in Washington, and Reykjavik and Washington, that just simply was the signing of a peace treaty. I mean, there were new arrangements made, but effectively, the Russians gave up the ambition of winning the Cold War by intimidation. It was as simple as that, I think. Now, once that happened, the left felt liberated. We didn't expect this, but the left felt liberated, and then you had the advent of they were no longer. The sympathy for communism, the sympathy for the Soviets, it just was no longer part of the burden they had to carry. Gorbachev was the liberator of the European left for that reason. So in the period from 1989 until the recent time, European politics entered a long and odd phase, which was not exactly replicated in Britain or America. And that phase was that the parties of the left became more respectable. They accepted the market. They moved towards a position in politics which was much less threatening to the interests of the middle class. They were transformed. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more from Frank and Nathan later about this, that the identity of the left went from being a working class party to being a public sector intellectuals party. And that has been made it more radical, but somehow less threatening. And now what you have is, and the result of that in European politics, in the European Parliament, and in Germany in particular, is that the left versus right argument has been replaced by the I would say a kind of repressive center dealing with a party of the right, which is increasingly working class in its support, and a party of the left, which is outside the acceptable left-wing views, the woke party, but which is now actually becoming more influential. But in the European Parliament, what you had was first of all the socialists united with the Christian Democrats, which is now effectively become a social democratic party. In fact, they say that themselves. The phenomenon of the social democratization of the Christian Democrats is a very common, is a very accepted description. I think it's true. That they are resisted by parties of the populist right and parties of the populist left, and the Christian Democrats and other mainstream conservative parties of that kind have, in a sense, lost any independent ideological concept. They have been absorbed by the left. Now, the result of that is that all over Europe, you no longer have left versus right arguments. You have it's not in every country, but it's becoming the standard. What you have is a grand coalition. The Germans pioneered this, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, and they pioneered this, but others have followed. And what is the result of that? Well, the result of that is that the ideologically stronger party gradually influences the weaker. And in the last 20 years, that has meant that the Christian Democrats have become a supportive member of a coalition that is, generally speaking, more moderate left than anything else. Now, obviously, the voters don't like this. They haven't gone along with it. Well, they have gone along with it, but they don't like it. And increasingly, as they become aware of this, the Christian Democrats in Europe as a whole, but particularly in Germany, have lost ground. They're neither Christian nor Democrat, and now they have gone from a regular 42-3% of the national vote to 22%. And they don't seem to be recovering. So the future of Europe, if this trend continues, is a kind of suffocating, over-regulated mass party with different elements in it: Green, Christian Democrat, Social Democrat, dominating the scene, satisfying very few people, alienating quite a lot. And in the last few European elections, that coalition, that grand coalition, has shrunk, and it's had to have new members absorbed. First of all, it was the Christian Democrats and the Socialists. Now then the Liberals were pulled in, and now the Greens have been pulled in. With every addition, it gains or sustains a few more seats, but with every addition, some other people, particularly among the voters, get unhappy and depressed. So why is this different to Britain? It's different to Britain because until now, the two-party system, as in America, has sustained a left-right debate. It's not the only factor that does. In the case of the United States, there are quite serious legal restraints on new parties entering the system, and the parties themselves enforce this as best they can through the courts. So it's very hard if you're American, to see anyone but the Republicans or the Democrats as likely to form the next government, and that will inevitably mean you may like RFK Jr. You may have, but sometimes those kind of candidates who come in as independents get as many as 20% of the vote. That happened in 92. Yeah. So recently in Britain, I've always described Britain as a 2.5-party system. It's normally had the Tories and Labour, and then you had the Liberals, which acted as a repository of protest votes between elections and in by-elections. But normally when it came down to choosing of the government, you went back to choosing between one of the two. So genuine argument and debate, passionate differences were represented in the House of Commons in arguments and debates across the floor. That's continued, and it was revived, I think, in the 2019 election, which saw a left-right divide more clearly than previous elections had done. I mean, more in the last few elections. It was clear that the two-party system idea was still going. It was revived. Now, it looks as though it's going into, it could be going in the next election into some kind of decay again. I'm not sure about that because it looks as though Labour will clearly win. And in a way, the clear victory of one of the two sides keeps the system alive longer. But that does mean, as I say, genuine debate and argument persists, although the whole of the ruling class in Europe, Britain, America, everywhere else in the Western world is getting less and less fond of free speech and more in favor of there being what's the word I want, a kind of controlled censorship of the center of views that they consider disturbing to public order and their own interests. And therefore, I think we're going to see in the next few years the politics of free speech as being the main division between, will be the main argument in politics, and it will be the main distinction between what happens in the Anglosphere and what happens in continental Europe. I'm not terribly confident about this having a good result, because the forces in Europe in favor of shaping an acceptable public opinion without allowing other points of view seem to me to be stronger naturally in continental Europe, and secondly, than in Britain and in America. And the natural rebelliousness of the Americans weighs in on the side of free speech. But I do think that, in a sense, the politics of liberty, broadly considered in economics and in social life, have a more natural dwelling place in the countries influenced by the classical liberal tradition, Britain, which began in Britain, than in the countries dominated much more by the economics of List and Colbert. Although in Europe, and particularly in Central Europe, we can turn for comfort, it seems to me, to the Austrian tradition, to Hayek, to your own record and work, and to the fact that within Central Europe in particular, but in other countries too, the desire to crush nationality or to ignore it is provoking resistance of a populist and nationalist kind, which I think the forces of classical liberalism and liberty in general will find acceptable allies in resisting the all-dominant state. Well, that's my view of what the situation is between the two countries now. I hope it was clear. I think it wavered a bit. I'll now come back and ask some questions to you. Thanks. First, would you have any response?
No, I would like, let's say, three short comments. Thank you for mentioning Churchill and his not only Fulton speech but Zurich speech as well. I must say that we didn't know that Churchill. You who lived in the Western world knew it. We didn't know that Churchill explicitly said that Europe should unify, but without Great Britain. I was asked, Fulton and Zurich speech, I was asked in the 1997, 50 years after the Zurich speech, to make the Zurich speech, the Churchill Zurich speech. So I studied very carefully his lecture there, and I discovered the statement that without us, without Great Britain. This is, for me, part of the debate today about about Europe and the Anglosphere. The Great Britain was always different. Second point, I fully agree with the social democratization of all political parties in Europe. I remember I always provoked explicitly Angela Merkel in many discussions I had with her, and I always say, Angela, why do you have two social democratic parties in Germany, but one is called social democratic, the other one doesn't dare to call itself social democratic, so misuses the term Christian. She didn't stand up and started protest. She laughed a little bit and was not able to answer. So the social democratization of all political parties is something for me absolutely tragic, and it is connected with the third point. The European elections now in 2 months already. Everyone is asking me in the interviews with the radio and newspapers here, ask me about my views about it. Everyone expects a radical shift. I am shocked. Who could make the shift? There is no one non-socialist democratic party in the European elections these days. These days, nothing can happen. I don't know how is it possible that someone expect a change. There will be definitely no change because there is no one asking for a substantial fundamental change. There are different slogans, different phrases, but the substance of all those political parties are the same.
I suppose you would say, couldn't you, that Viktor Orban is asking for that and arguing for it, and doing so on the basis of suggesting that he is leading a new Christian Democrat party, which is an insurgent and genuine Christian Democrat party. And I suppose one can argue, and I think I would argue this, that there are one or two issues which would make an alliance between classical liberals on the one hand and, I would say, patriotic and traditional-minded people on the other relatively easy to, it would be recreating the old conservative parties, because the old conservative parties were an alliance, really, of social traditionalists and religious people, the economic conservatives of one kind or another. So obviously there were different kinds, but let me put it this way. A conservatism that isn't financially sound is not going to be a successful conservatism. I mean, just to take an example from British politics, Dennis Healey, a socialist of a moderate kind, was very clear that you couldn't build socialism, he said, on financially unsound bases. Of course, they always do, but he could see that it was an unrealistic proposition because it would, in the end, discredit socialism. It would discredit a financially unsound conservatism, would discredit conservatism much more quickly because financial soundness is important to it. But anyway, so the second, the three, social traditionalists, economic conservatives, and I would say national interest or social fabric conservatives, people who believe that the job of conservatism is to maintain and, if possible, in modest ways, improve the society, not just economically, but also in terms of its social, of its public moral character, and so on. No, you can't go too far in that. The Turks proposed some years ago to make adultery a criminal offence, which the EU said was contrary to European values, which was interesting. Anglo-Saxons had always considered that adultery was probably a European value, but it was interesting to have the European Commission confirm this. So those three things were always there. And it was only after 1989 that people started saying that there was no place for patriotism and nationalism in this, except in a very narrow defense field. And I just think that that's not real. That in the people who tend to vote for conservative parties in European and both countries tend to be people who think that even if they don't believe in God, they believe in the social role of religion. They may not particularly want to cut their own spending, but they think that spending should be controlled. They may not. They may be peaceful-minded people, but they want to make sure that the police are available when there's a riot. Now, all of these things, the importance of public order and so on, all of these things are lying around to be picked up by any politician who's got the wit to see people are concerned about them. And yet, conservative parties, particularly in recent years, have shown not only a lack of interest in exploiting issues that are supposed to concern them, but even a kind of faintly snobbish resistance to trying to please the voters who want those things. And that is one of the most interesting sociological aspects of modern politics. I wonder if you have any ideas on what explains it.
I really don't know what we started so many topics, so I don't know which one to choose. Let's return to the roads to serfdom, roads to liberty. So for me, social democratism is a road to serfdom, definitely, by definition. And at the beginning, after the fall of communism, John, we were not afraid of the communists, We were afraid of the social democratism, as it used to be called, the third way thinking, That was the main fear we experienced. I remember I was, for the first time, in Davos at the World Economic Forum 5 weeks after the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia in January 1990. And I had a speech on the main stage, and the first question came, what do you plan for the future? Are you in favor of the third way? Came the question with Klaus Schwab sitting next to me on the stage, And I, quite unprepared, made an answer which has been quoted many times. I said, no. We know that the third way is the fastest way to the third world. It was even on Wikipedia as a quotation. So we were so much afraid of all kinds of third ways, and the social democratization of most political parties in Europe, plus the greening of all political parties, is the main enemy of our current era. To fight communism is really a total nonsense these days, but to fight these new isms is a real task for all of us.
Well, let me add to that, if I may, because obviously I think you're correct. That phrase, the fastest way to the third world, is illustrated dramatically by net zero. Net zero, the policies of net zero. Now, the policies of net zero are absolutely, they're both candid and concealed. It's very interesting. There's a committee in Britain created by the House of Commons, the Climate Change Committee, I think it is. That's the title. It's created by the Climate Change Act, and it's it's an official body which is designed to keep telling the government you're not doing enough. In other words, it's a very weird thing. Most of the time, the committees created by government are there to protect government. This is there to continue to emphasize that how little it is doing to bring about net zero. And they will publish estimates of what will be the impact of net zero. And they are, in some respects, quite alarming, that we'll have to change our diets, we won't be able to travel abroad, a whole series of lifestyle restrictions. And they will also have to pay more in taxes, and we will have to pay more in energy prices. To protect the government, they smuggle the increase in the price of regulation into the price of the product, so people blame the energy companies for the high prices. But these are the results of the direct instructions of government. And when they get to the total financial cost, they get a bit coy, and all of the estimates produced by official sources are much lower than those produced by independent sources. And so what you have here is a policy which, first of all, is extremely expensive. Second, is designed to actually reduce living standards. Thirdly, will have only the most nugatory impact on carbon emissions, since in the case of Britain, we account for about 0.5% of total world emissions. And we are making these draconian restrictions, which include, for example, actually blowing up coal mines so they can't be reused again if a future government comes in and decides to change the policy. We're pursuing a utopian goal which even its advocates concede won't make much difference, at the cost of enormous changes in the life of the people, downwards rather than upwards. You might think that nobody would support this, but in fact, until the actual painful impact happens, people do. So I would say at the moment, we are bound to have a conservative reaction at some point. It probably, I agree, won't be in the next European elections. And it probably will certainly not be in the next British elections, which will in effect be an endorsement of the most draconian policy restrictions.
John, you mean in next European elections? You mean 2047 or something like that? Yeah. Otherwise, it's meaningless to dream about anything like that. It's only wishful thinking to expect that something comes earlier.
Well, I would put it this way. You probably know this line. It's from, I think, Ernest Hemingway. A man is asked, how did he go broke? And he said, first gradually, then quickly. And I think myself that's the way. We are facing the politics of crises, politics driven by crises. But that means politics which are changes which are coming too late. But they will come, I think, because people are not going to live in rich countries which are used to improving living standards. They're not going to live in places in which they can't heat their homes, in which they can only drive their cars in a short range. We now have the phenomenon you probably know about called 15-minute cities, in which this is something which no one had the slightest idea was being considered. But the kind of permanent bureaucracy is making these plans for us all the time. They can make all those plans without protest. But the moment that people are actually told they can't drive their car anywhere, or they have to change their car to an electric car, if you're a salesman who relies on his car, that's a nightmare, because you're not going to be able to, in a sense, conduct the same level of business as you could when you had a petrol-driven car. So all of these things are problems. I see an energy expert arriving to correct me. But let me put it this way. Unless you find a more market-driven way of reducing carbon emissions, then the state-ordered way is going to produce a backlash. I don't know when.
John, you know that I published 2 books about the nonsense of global warming. So do we have now 10 hours to explain the main arguments? Or well, this is absolutely evident that there is a slight warming of the Earth, but the connection there is no proof about the connection with the CO2 emissions. It's absolutely clear, but it's impossible to explain it to anyone in Europe, especially not in the European Commission. And but this is not the topic of Anglosphere versus Europe. I'm sorry.
No, it's not. No.
This is.
It's the topic of people versus governments. Yeah.
Better to make something. China is here and is here to stay. That's the only definition. China is, in my understanding, non-aggressive, has time, is not in a hurry. China is not impatient. China will slowly grow, being more powerful, but doesn't have a motivation in a foreseeable future to change something dramatically. I don't see it as a tomorrow's enemy, or my enemy is, I am quoting permanently something because we published recently a book in our institute with the title Self-Destruction of the West. Self-destruction of the West. And I stress not destruction of the West, self-destruction of the West. The West is undermining itself. It's not done by Putin or China or anyone else. So I am not that much interested in China, really. I am much more interested in what is going in Brussels and Berlin and Paris. And my enemy, my tangible enemy is not in Beijing. My tangible enemy is in Brussels, and it's symbolized by Madame von der Leyen. No. So to write interesting books about China is for me a way how to escape from the serious debates of today's world in our part of the world. I don't underestimate China, definitely not. But I don't underestimate Brussels, much more.
Let me ask a question directly related to your career. What you just said about self-destruction of the West, it seems to me to be very clear and right. Of course, this is the second occasion we've seen this in our lives, isn't it? You were in the early days of seeing the attempt at self-destroying Europe via Marxism, spring leaks. When did you first realize that the Marxist system was in the end, didn't have many, well, not only was going to end, but secondly, did not have many years to go?
Well, I don't know, but I think that people like me, my generation, born, I mistakenly always used to say born in Czechoslovakia, which is not true. I was born in Protectorate Böhmen-Mähren. I was born during the Second World War, and we were part of Germany. We were the Protectorate of Germany, by the way. For my generation, we were forced to study the communist way of thinking, but we succeeded in overcoming it in ourselves, And this process of changing our mind was extremely, extremely important, as I understand it. Just to be born now and to say that Marxism is wrong is simply... But I was forced to study Karl Marx in original Das Kapital in difficult German, you know. It was a nonsense, I know, but you learn something, and you were forced to think about many things seriously, and it was not the loss of the time, you know. We learned a lot in this. So this process of refusing this ideology was our natural process of evolution in our thinking. I couldn't say that I got at home from my parents from the age 3 that Marxism is nonsense. Definitely not. So we for us, at least in my country and in this generation, the 1960s was the process of radical change, not the 68, the end, but the whole 1960s. And at that moment, for me, I haven't read one Marxist economic article in 1963-64. I would say I started to study University of Chicago, Milton Friedman and George Stigler and Gary Becker, you know. So we already in the communist era started to totally refuse this thinking and this ideology. And so in this respect, we were more or less prepared for the fall of communism in November '89.
Let me suggest. I know we're coming to. Sorry. Oh, okay. I should tell you, you're invited to lunch. It will be served in the Galleria.
It would be more rational, probably. I agree.
It will be served in the Galleria. But I'm just going to sort of finish by saying, first of all, thank you very much for coming, as always. Enormous amounts of wisdom and common sense from you. But what your last remarks, it seems to me, contain an ominous element, which is communism helped to bring about its own demise because it still did support traditional decent education in the schools. It may have censored and so on, but it still expected people to learn and so on. Now, the new woke Marxism, so to speak, is actually destroying the education and not simply not producing educated people, it is producing miseducated people who have seemed to be, at least for the moment, immune to argument. So let's hope that the next generation will find it easier to climb out of the arguments of the government than seems likely at the moment.
That's all. I am not supposed to answer.